The United States joins the fight. The United States of America held on to its isolationist practices for quite some time after World War I broke out. Embracing the Monroe Doctrine from a century earlier, President Wilson pledged in 1914 to keep the U.S. out of Europe's most recent political disaster. America had been peopled by nations all over Europe, from both sides of the fight, and it was Wilson's opinion that it would be best to not merely avoid fighting in Europe, but also to avoid dividing nationalities within the United States. When running for president for a second time in 1916, Wilson pledged to do what he had done for 2 years, keep the U.S. out of the war in Europe. Now you may remember that in the election of 1912, when the Republicans split into the Progressive Bull Moose Party and the Republican Party under Taft, Wilson had won the presidency with a mere 41% of the popular vote, only because the Republicans split up. This time, however, he won on his own merit. Earning over 49% of the popular vote, Wilson edged out the Republican candidate Charles Fairbanks, who captured only 46.1% of the vote. But could Wilson keep us out of the war? Despite its pledge to remain neutral, the United States had clearly chosen its favorites in this fight. After the war broke out in 1914, the U.S. continued to trade with England and France much more heavily than with Germany. Initially, the U.S. was trading in food and raw materials, but as the war in Europe intensified, it became clear that if England fell, our economy would face stiff repercussions. The U.S. began smuggling weapons and munitions to the members of the Triple Entente. Naturally, this angered Germany, who began practicing unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any seafaring vessels that crossed the Atlantic. The most notorious of these sinkings was that of the ship the Lusitania in May of 1915. The Lusitania was the sister ship of the Titanic, which was sunk by an iceberg in 1912. The fact was that the Lusitania was smuggling weapons to England and France, but the public didn't know this. Supposedly carrying only passengers to and from Europe, the media used Germany's sinking of an unarmed passenger vessel to turn popular opinion against Germany and move Americans closer to war. Many Americans traveled overseas simply to join the French Foreign Legion, the French Air Force, or the British Army to engage against Germany, even before the United States had joined the fight. In January of 1917, afraid that its practice of unrestricted submarine warfare would bring the United States into the conflict against Germany and Austria, those Central Powers then tried to bring Mexico into a conspiracy. Promising Mexico the land it had lost in the Mexican-American War if it declared war on the U.S., the Central Powers hoped to catch the U.S. off guard and prevent it from helping Europe by enmeshing us in a war on our own soil. The telegram to Mexico was intercepted by the British. The Mexicans denied any involvement in the Central Powers plan, and anti-German sentiments only boiled hotter in America. Wilson needed to work hard to keep America out of this war, but a revolution in Russia during 1917 would solidify the need for our country to join the fight. In early 1917, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky led the Bolsheviks in Russia in a revolution to oust Tsar Nicholas II. One of their chief complaints was the Tsar's commitment to fight in World War I, a war that had absolutely devastated Russia, who was clearly losing the fight by the time the communists revolted. After Lenin and Trotsky had successfully toppled the government, they quickly surrendered to the Central Powers. This spelled trouble for the Allied forces of England and France because Germany had been fighting a war on two fronts and had to split its forces. Now, with Russia out of the picture, Germany could concentrate only on the West. If England and France were to have any hope of emerging victorious, they would need fresh, new troops to reinforce and reinvigorate their efforts. On April of 1917, the Allied powers got their wish. The U.S. joined World War I shortly after Russia, now the USSR, had surrendered. Reinforced by over 4 million American doughboys, many of whom had to be drafted via the Selective Service Act, the Central Powers were quickly overwhelmed. Europe had been fighting brutal trench warfare for 3 years, but Americans had seen none of this conflict, so they brought a much-needed vigor and spirit to the fight. By November of 1918, the fighting was over, as on the 11th day of the 11th month, the Central Powers surrendered. Consequences of World War I. On the evening before President Wilson addressed Congress requesting a declaration of war against Germany, he told a New York Times reporter, quote, "Lead this people into war, and they'll forget there was ever such a thing as tolerance. To fight, you must be brutal and ruthless, and the spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into the very fiber of national life, infecting the Congress, the courts, the policeman on the beat, the man in the street." Wilson was forecasting the changes and consequences this fight would have upon the United States and its people, and he was not exaggerating. During the brief year and a half the U.S. fought from 1917 to 1918, tough restrictive laws on free speech and immigration would be passed. The end of the war would see Americans turn their political allegiance back to the Republican Party in large numbers. The U.S. would sicken of fighting and bitterly return to isolationism. Wilson, a pacifist in practice, would propose dramatic and idealistic goals for peace in Europe, only to see his hopes dashed at home by an angry Congress. Most importantly, the roots for World War II and the conflict in Vietnam would be sown by the failures of the world's powers to create a lasting peace at Versailles Palace. Freedom shrinks. By 1917, over 2 million Germans had immigrated into the United States, and they felt the brunt of anti-European hatred aroused during the war. American orchestras refused to play music by Beethoven or Mozart. Schools stopped teaching German. Dachshunds became the victory pups. Sauerkrauts became victory cabbage. Thousands changed their last names to Smith or Jones. Librarians removed German authors from the shelves. There were multiple occasions of deliberate violence against German Americans, flogging, tarring and feathering, and even the lynching of one German-born person, Robert Prager. Prohibition, which had been in the works since the mid-1800s, found a convenient scapegoat in German breweries. Many beer companies were German, if at least in name. Supporting German beer was support for the enemy, and in early 1918, the 18th Amendment had enough momentum riding the wave of anti-German sentiments to pass into law. Alcohol would be illegal to make, sell, or transport until 1933. In 1917, Congress passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Now, if these sound familiar, and they should, as they bear strong resemblance to the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by John Adams, when France and the U.S. nearly came to blows in the 1790s, it's because a pattern was emerging. During wartime, America tended to restrict the liberties and freedoms its citizens enjoyed. These specific laws punished with jail time and very stiff fines anyone expressing publicly in any way anything disloyal or critical of the U.S. government or its war effort. Socialist presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs was found guilty of violating this law when he encouraged Americans not to register for the draft, and was given a 10-year jail sentence and a $10,000 fine. He still ran for president in 1920, capturing over 2% of the popular vote from his cell. Union leaders and members also faced strong persecution for any activities such as strikes or calls for wage raises, which threatened U.S. production during the war.